Welcome to Unit 9 of EDSE 510. As we look at the course schedule, you'll see that Unit 9 is a 2-week-long unit. We do not have a discussion for this unit. Instead, we will be working on a pretty big assignment called the Educational Philosophy paper, and it will be due on the very final day of this unit at 11:59 p.m. and that is Mountain Standard Time. So we do have 2 weeks of Unit 9 to work on this paper, as well as to review the content in the unit. And looking ahead, you'll see that for the remaining units, all we have to do, other than reviewing the assigned content, would be to complete these discussion boards. So this educational philosophy paper is the final bulk assignment that will be due for this course. So it's important to really use this as an opportunity to celebrate the learning that we've been doing and the culmination of this course and all of your new knowledge and the new perspectives. We have discussed the philosophy paper a bit in a previous video, but this video will be an opportunity for us to dive in a little bit more depth here as we talk about it. First, we'll take a look at the Unit 9 content. You'll notice that Unit 9 is split into 2 parts, and that's just because of organization of the course shell and keeping those separate so that you can look through them at your leisure as we move through the unit. So part 1 will be personal and emotional development. And you can see in the course schedule that for Unit 9, we do also have focus on the topic of bullying and some of those social issues that come about. And you'll notice that Unit 9 does include for you several different resources and links related to the topic of depression. And many students with or without IEPs may experience depression during the educational career. For our purposes, because this is a special education course, we'll be thinking about depression particularly in students with IEPs and some of these mental health concerns that might either go along with a different eligibility category, or perhaps a student is eligible due to a serious emotional disability and that affective need is related to depressive mood or disorder along those lines. So those are some resources for you to check out regarding depression. This is a link for information about social emotional learning, and this is an opportunity for you to watch a video. This is a professor at Stanford, Linda Darling Hammond, and the video focuses on the collaborative classroom. Social emotional learning, or SEL, is a really hot topic in the field right now. Probably all familiar with it. But I would encourage you in particular to check out the CASEL website, CASEL, and you can just go ahead and type that into Google and you'll be able to find social emotional learning. This is the collaborative for academic social emotional learning, so CASEL, with information for practitioners, information for families and districts on SEL in action. So you can click on any of these little tabs, but one of them, SEL in action, you could go to trends and best practices. And you'll see that there are a lot of documents here that you can review under resources, implementation tools and resources. There is a guide to school-wide SEL that you can click on and take a look at, scroll down. There's a lot that can be accessed on this website for free regarding social emotional learning, several different steps. Adult social emotional learning obviously is very important for staff, and that can be integrated with professional development, working with leadership. And then obviously promoting social emotional learning and these standards and skills for students as well, both school-wide, kind of that big picture approach, and then coming down to one-on-one work with students and those interventions. So back to the Canvas shell, we do have a PowerPoint that we can look at that will also be addressing some of these topics. And so this will supplement your understanding of students who are impacted by emotional or behavioral disorders that may be eligible for special education due to serious emotional disability. So this is just information for you regarding that eligibility category. And we might see students experiencing anxiety disorders, there may be mood disorders. There's just a list here of several different eligibility categories you may see. Some students may have an outside diagnosis from a therapist, a medical provider, a psychiatrist who's provided that. Other students may not have ever received community-based mental health services, and it just depends upon the family and the situation. As we know, there are many different circumstances that we might encounter, and we just need to be prepared to do our best to serve the student regardless of any intervention that the child has or has not received. So we might see students with externalizing behaviors, and this could be that acting out, the noncompliance, and those might be clues that we may need to evaluate, make sure that student isn't in need of some mental health school-based support or even some center-based programming, depending on the situation, in order to access the free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. You may also see some of those internalizing components, and that could be that withdrawal. We were just mentioning the depression and the anxiety. And you can see some of these, one may be going on a given day and the other on the next day, or even both within the same day. It all just depends on the situation. We may also work with students who have experienced significant trauma. And the interesting part about trauma is that there can be such a major impact on social emotional well-being and on self-regulation and on relationships, and yet we as educators rarely get the full story regarding a student's life experiences. So if the student chooses to or is able to communicate to us regarding things that have happened, we may get some information that way. If we receive a social history from the parent or guardian or from the previous school or an outside service provider with a release of information, we may gather background that way. But oftentimes you'll work with a student who has experienced some significant traumatic events and is then manifesting some of these issues related to those experiences and processing through that, and yet we don't have information on what the experiences were. And we really do need to use that effective trauma-informed approach, relationship-based, developing trust, demonstrating consistency, keeping ourselves regulated to promote students' self-regulation as they observe us. All of those things, avoiding touching students, in a situation where a child is escalated, a person might think that reaching out and using physical touch might be appropriate. And sometimes that is a sensory component that can be done as a best practice. It just depends on the child, depends on the situation. But other times that can set off a trauma response, especially if a child has been physically abused or something along those lines. So keeping that trauma-informed approach and that awareness is essential in this school setting, regardless of the age or stage or situation of the child. And the final note I would make about that is that we just often don't know what the cause may be. And on slide 9 of this presentation, you'll see there are a lot of things that can bring about some of this. Sometimes we've got that biopsychosocial consideration and that lens that we have to use for, is there something in the brain going on? That biological approach is this chemical. We've got a mental illness situation, a disorder that needs to be diagnosed. Biopsychosocial. On the psychological side, we might be looking more at even that social component of trauma and how those two can blend together. And the environment, if a student is having significant stress, the student might have food scarcity, or if there's an abuse situation going on, obviously we are mandatory reporters as educators, but sometimes we don't know what's going on at home. So we're just doing our absolute best, and school factors, of course, can exacerbate some of that. And a student who might do fairly well at home with self-regulation may come to school and experience non-preferred tasks and demands that require stamina, and peer conflicts and all of those components, changes in routine, may lead to behavioral concerns and social-emotional problems and kind of set off some of this. So it's really important for us to look at the antecedents there and make sure that we're approaching that in a supportive and informed manner. You'll also see information in this PowerPoint regarding The impact a student with a serious emotional disability oftentimes may be more likely to drop out of high school, which, as we know, can be a big concern for post-secondary goals and employment and training and education. So we want to do everything we can to avoid that in the majority of situations. Students with serious emotional disabilities may have difficulty with engaging in post-secondary education. And part of that is, as we all know, post-secondary education does require a lot of stress management, executive functioning, emotional regulation, overcoming challenges, and managing those interpersonal interactions as well. So for students with serious emotional disability, where mental health concerns or emotional regulation issues are often overriding the academic access, a student may not be set up for success for post-secondary education and training, or even employment or independent living, unless the school has a really solid and supportive plan in place to meet some of those lagging skills and develop a really, really good IEP. So obviously we want a really strong IEP for any student with an IEP, but that's just a little note on students with serious emotional disabilities in particular. In part 2, we're talking about cultural justice and even the bullying component. So there is a PowerPoint here that you can view. There is some information in this presentation that is related to suicide, so please view that at your discretion. Obviously, this is a sensitive topic. It's important to have some awareness of this, of course, in the field, regardless of the age group for students that you're working with, but you may choose not to view this component, and that is completely up to you. So when we're seeing bullying for students with disabilities, with IEPs, we might see this particularly for those who struggle with social skills and communication. That might be a student on the autism spectrum or a student who's eligible with a serious emotional disability. So there's a definition provided for you here in the PowerPoint of bullying, and just looking through some of the legal components. Cyberbullying obviously is a really big concern. There's a video here that is linked for you, so we can see obviously information included regarding not only the issues of students with disabilities being bullied, but also the issue of a student with a disability who might be doing the bullying. So take the time to look through this PowerPoint, see some of this information, so that you can just have a really solid preventative approach as you work with your students. This is a video with information on a program called Kiva, and there is a link here included for you that you can check out. This is an option for anti-bullying programming and program being tested in the United States. So there's an article here linked for you coming from Kansas, and this is a 2013 article, so it is a bit older, but it'll still give you some information about the programming. There is a module here for you, and that's something you can look through for information, particularly on cyberbullying. This really is important for your awareness, regardless of the age group, students that you're working with. We often think of these things as high school issues, but in reality, there's a big impact for students across settings. So the module will look like this, and you can go through each link. And then you'll see as we move forward, there are a couple PDF articles for you regarding areas in which bullying might be most prevalent, and a whole school approach. This could align with some of the whole school CASEL content that we were talking about earlier in this lecture to just reduce and prevent this bullying, as we know there are so many negative outcomes for both the student who's perpetrating as well as for the students who are impacted by it. So definitely something for administration to be aware of, as well as anybody working in a school setting, and special educator in particular. So here we are on the Educational Philosophy Literature Review paper. We did hit on this paper in the previous video lecture, so I'll encourage you to check that out. But my biggest suggestions for you would just be to look through, obviously, this whole prompt and the rubric. But the bold components are going to be the most important things for you to pay attention to. So the paper will be 8 to 12 pages. You'll want to have research that's as recent as you can find. You'll have at least 10 sources. And then you're really going to want to make sure that you have headings for each of the major sections. So the bullet points are the major sections. You want a strong thesis statement, and then obviously APA 7th edition format. So watch the rubric closely. Here's a visual for you. All of these different topics you'll be talking about will come out with your philosophy and your plan to apply that philosophy. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Have a great week.